Last point, and I'm not going to write this down because it's quite a bit, but comparative philology allowed philologists to recognize that there was a possibility to systematize linguistic analysis, and that's important, right? The ability to systematize linguistic, what did I say, analysis. And so Saussure recognized this, right? He recognized the potential for an analysis of language to become systematized, right? To become, if you will, scientific. And that's what he's attempting to do. There is a problem with the comparative philologists, however, and there's this big but. But, quote, they did not manage to found a new science of linguistics. So despite all of their efforts, right, and they being the comparative philologists, the comparative grammarians, they weren't able to, quote, manage to find a new science of linguistics. There was no new science of linguistics. Why wasn't there a new systematized science of linguistics despite their efforts? Well, because it was primarily comparative, right? It was sort of comparing structures, as we said before. My relationship to my community of speakers, my structure in language, English, compared to the structure of grammar and rules in German. So it's comparative. It's not really giving me what I said before that we're looking for, the conditions for the possibility of sort of epistemologically understanding language. What Saussure recognizes is, listen, the comparative philologists, comparative grammarians, were close, but they failed in regard to an inability to really attain systematization. He gives a critique, right? Saussure gives a critique. So that completes the three phases, or how did I word it? Yeah, the three phases. So he gives a critique of comparative Saussure gives a critique of comparative philology. The first thing that he said was problematic for comparative philology is that it was limited to Indo-European languages, right? Comparative philology at the time, at least, was sort of, it sequestered itself, right? It was just, we're going to be looking at Indo-European. As a Swiss linguist, it was, I think it's pretty interesting that Saussure had the insight, given the historical time that he lived, to recognize that we cannot make, and this is illogical, right? We can't make universal generalizations based on a few cases, right? You can't make claims about everything based on some things. So it might be the case that these Indo-European languages are being analyzed, and now comparative philology is a lot broader, obviously, but at the time it was limited to Indo-European languages, and then make claims about semiological claims about language as such, right? You need to give a comprehensive account. So that's the first problem, right? Limited. I'll just put limited scope. L-I-M-I-T-E-D. Number two, the second problem was a failure to extrapolate on comparative connections, and that's obvious, right? If we're going to be talking about just even with respect to Indo-European languages, and I'm going to say, well, I'm going to do a comparative account between German and English, or German and Finnish, or what have you. Insofar as I'm doing that account, if I do not extrapolate on each point, right? So, for example, conjugation of verbs within different languages, role of the structure, the organization of clauses, you know, where do clauses go, and so on and so on and so on, then, you know, your account sort of fails, right? For your comparative analysis theoretically to be, and this has changed, but given the time, for your comparative philology to be sound universally, you have to approximate the universal, right? We have to compare on all accounts. That's a very laborious process, right? That's a generational process. That's not a process that someone's going to be able to complete in their lifetime, right? It's not going to happen. Next is a direct quote from Saussure. Quote, "There's a failure to reflect the conditions which do not obtain in language everywhere." And that's what I'm saying, right? It's a failure to, quote, reflect the conditions that obtain in languages everywhere. Your claim as a comparative philologist, as a comparative grammarian, should at least approximate universal linguistic claims, right? You cannot look at the very selective comparison between English and German and then use that to sort of universalize your linguistic claims. One obvious point is in speaking Mandarin, there are tones, and the pitch in which, or the tone in which the word is stated is going to change meaning of the word, right? So that literally the word is written the same, but the way that the word is said based on the tonal pitch will change the meaning. Semiologists need to account for that, right? There needs to be an account for that, because on paper, unless there are accents written into the tones, which they are now, it's going to be impossible for a non-native speaker to make sense of the. And then the last point is the critique is that it is a comparison. This is a quote from Saussure. Comparison is only a tool, and he's right. To look at language comparatively, what I'm doing is I'm presupposing the existence of language. I'm saying that here is the existence of a language, here's the existence of a second language, and I'm comparing and contrasting some correlation between the two languages. That analysis, this type of analysis, this comparative analysis, presupposes the existence of the language. So what Saussure does is Saussure talks about and is more interested in not the tool of comparison, but the conditions, the necessary and sufficient conditions that account for the existence of the structure as such. So that's what he's attempting in this part. The last part of this, and to wrap up the first section, has to do with the neogrammarians. And it was really the role and the function that the neogrammarians played in sort of the evolving historical account of semiotics and semiology that really influenced Saussure. It's because the neogrammarian movement that Saussure recognized that we could now talk about the conditions for the possibility of systematizing, as was said in comparative philology and comparative grammar, systematizing language, systematizing linguistic analysis, right? And that's what he's attempting to do. Saussure wants to make linguistic analysis elevated, quote unquote, to the level of a science. All right, so with that, let's analyze the role of the neogrammarians. All right, so the neogrammarians. First point is they contextualize comparative philology. So there's a contextualization of comparative philology within a historical context, and I gave you a discussion of that earlier. What we recognize is from the three phases of linguistics, right? From the three phases of linguistics, we move from grammar to philology, from philology to comparative philology, and we recognize that historically speaking, what's happening is linguists are they're recognizing that we can create a more foundational account, a more stable, more systematized account of, quote-unquote, the conditions for the possibility of language. So here's the question. The question is, quote, what is the connection between language then? What is the connection between language, what we say, and what exists, right? What is the connection between language and reality? The attempt to answer this, the attempt to answer the question, what is the connection between language and reality, is going to sort of haunt us. The question is going to haunt us, and I don't want to give too much away yet, but the question is asking the following. I know that I'm saying something, so I know that I see, and I've done this lecture before, but I see and I'm a philosopher, so this is the only example that the philosophers should or could give. I see this fuzzy little cat on a mat, and I make the claim that the cat is on the mat. And the question is, my statement, the cat is on the mat, what is that statement's relationship to the fact that the cat is on the mat? How do we come to understand that? And what's most interesting for me, and it was like my intro to philosophy class when I was super brand new to this and I didn't know anything, I was completely amazed that somebody could spend their entire academic career trying to analyze the relationship between the sentence, the cat is on the mat, and the cat being on the mat. I thought that, I mean, how much could somebody possibly write about that relationship? A paragraph? And I got deeper into this and I realized that people have written volumes and volumes of books to account for the relationship between the statement, the sentence, the cat is on the mat, and there being a cat on the mat. There's all different types of interpretation of that. There's a nominalist interpretation, a structuralist interpretation, a realist interpretation, a post-structuralist interpretation, a deconstructionist interpretation, and so on, a social constructionist interpretation. There's many different interpretations of the relationship between the statement, the cat is on the mat, a Kantian interpretation, which is the best interpretation, between the term, the sentence, and the reality, right? What is that relationship? So it's important that you recognize that sort of hovering in the background. And my interpretation, just to give you a quick preview into where this is going, is the question is essentially what's going to complicate the discussion. I think the question is inherently flawed, but I don't want to give too much away just yet, right?